Bryer County, Kentucky, in the year 1919, kept its secrets high and damp in the spruce shade above a narrow creek. A census sheet from a cabin at the end of a wagon trace listed a newborn as both sibling and child to the same boy. The handwriting was even, the tally marks tidy, as if order could domesticate what the hills refused to confess. Before we dive in, please subscribe if you like this kind of exclusive investigation. Quiet, uncomfortable, and relentlessly sourced. The narrator here is a county librarian, trained to track paper more than people. The work began not with a confession, but with a cart, wobbling along stacks in late autumn. A misfiled birth register rode there, jammed between a land survey and a Farm Bureau circular. 2 leaves in that register had been trimmed down and restitched with thread thin as a hair. The ink was iron gall, brown to tea. On the margin, a faint circle and a triangle overlapped like an old brand. This investigation looked for shape inside that mark. A census taker, crossing the ridge during a dry spell of that year, initialed a sheet in a cabin at Clay Hollow. The page's first line named a woman who had borne 6 children. The second line held a boy, adolescent by his listed age, marked as son. A later entry named an infant and accidentally linked its parent box both to the head of household and to that boy. A clerk back in town drew a light dash to correct it. The dash wavered. From that quiver the thread begins. Who in that cabin counted kin against law, custom, and mercy? Did a teenage son sleep with his own mother and then sleep with his own sister, fathering a child who was both sibling and offspring? And if so, who helped keep the papers still? The hollow earned its name from what clung to boots. The road remained 2 ruts braced by laurel. A creek crossed the path in several places, thin like green glass, then vanished under a shelf of rock. Houses were far apart by at least 3 rugged miles, which on foot meant near an hour of silence broken by crows. The cabin in the record stood on a bench of ground above a bend. A smokehouse, a corn patch, a pen of rails, and a shed roofed with spare bark. No grid reached here, no electric lines for another 2 decades, no phone. Long distances turned short laws into rumors. Old school rolls, when they existed at all, showed children with the same eyes. Pale, with an inward slant at the corners, and hair described by teachers as coarse. Ages staggered oddly. 2 births within 1 calendar winter, then none for several years, then 2 more within the space of 1 harvest. The surname changed spelling beyond mere clerk error, as if the family had tried on letters to shrug off notice. Illness records from a church circuit writer listed rashes and fevers sweeping the home in uneven rings, striking some but not others, like a wheel that wobbles and returns. At the county clerk's counter, a set of juvenile dependency files sat beneath a tin sign that promised order in exchange for silence. Requests to view them brought out forms and narrowed eyes. The explanation, paraphrased from the careful language of officialdom, held that reputations, living or not, demanded protection. A registrar suggested the librarian pursue land tax maps instead. Another recommended the state archives. Between desks, responsibility flowed like the creek in flood, noisily elsewhere. Among the misfiled documents lay a wedding photo, silvered and curling at the corners. The bride wore a plain dress with a lace collar. The groom bore a jaw that mirrored hers so closely that the distance between cousin and sibling felt shallow. In the birth register, cramped entries repeated a father's given name with a mother's name that recurred across decades. In 2 entries, the father's name matched a male child who would have been barely past childhood himself. Ink density suggested a later overwriting, stronger strokes atop weaker ones, as if someone returned to fortify a lie. A penciled notation on one ledger leaf read, HC, echoed on the back of the wedding photo. Old-timers interviewed by sociologists in later decades called such arrangements a circuit. Unofficial, domestic, defended by hunger and fear, pairings rotated within a household after a patriarch died or left. This community's variant gained a name here for clarity, the Hearth Circuit. It moved labor, reproduction, and silence in an inward loop, always returning to the fire that cooked the same pot of beans. A tax assessor's soil map bore pins along the ridge. Each pin had initials, several clustered at the hollow, all with the same first letter. The acreage split into strips, then reunited again by quitclaim, like a deck shuffled by a bored dealer. After a year of poor harvests, liens appeared, then disappeared. A note in the margin mentioned that the cabin stood off-line, a phrase meaning beyond easy measurement. Places that resist measurement often resist law. Neighbors traded meat for mended harness, coal for milk. The men hired out to the mine mouths 2 valleys away, sometimes staying for nights in a bunkhouse. The women kept kitchen gardens and tended infants. Births happened at home, deaths too. The nearest doctor followed the rails and the money. He did not climb high without pay. Records traveled poorly when carried in apron pockets and left under oil lamps. The Hearth Circuit, if it lived here, used the lack of a calendar to move without footprints. When floods came in late spring, a shed on the courthouse lawn filled with damp, unclaimed documents laid on racks like trout. The librarian learned to read warping. Pages that had been folded and tucked deep inside other volumes ballooned to reveal their secrets. In one such swell, a marginal note emerged along the edge of a christening list. Father and brother same. The ink had bled just enough to make the words legible. The hills kept faces. The paper leaked patterns. All names here are altered, and institutions are composites. The aim is not spectacle, but accuracy. The question remains, who benefited from keeping a son in a bed he should never have shared? And how did officials, neighbors, and poverty itself braid it into that bed frame? A tree sketched on scrap showed a woman, here called May, with the children spread across nearly 2 decades. One child, here called Eli, appeared both as son and, inferred by the register, as father to a newborn listed under May's roof. A later infant, here called Ruth, bore the same father's given name, but the mother line shifted to a young woman, here called Liza, who lived in the same home. If that reading is true, Eli slept with his own mother, and later slept with his own sister. The sketch was tentative, but the gaps between birthdays and the absence of marriage licenses traced a rough border. Requests to the state archive for midwife logs and infirmary transport notes returned months later with polite refusals, summarized as unavailability due to deterioration. A separate inquiry for railroad accident claims, useful for tracking male kin, produced a stack of forms missing the years that mattered. County commissioners considered the past a quarry for heritage, not a mine for truth. Funding for records restoration went elsewhere. With every ask, the librarian learned what not to ask next. The cabin had collapsed into itself. A chimney stood, taller than a man. Stones blackened high up where a stovepipe once fed smoke into air cold enough to bite lungs. Bottle glass glittered in dirt, thick and pale. A rusted bed frame lay half buried, its springs a web of tired coils. On one coil, a loop of hair still held shape, daubed with something that could have been tallow. The ground sloped to the creek, then rose into a stand of poplar. A child's shoe heel, leather worn to nap, tucked under leaf litter. The place spoke in fragments. Across disparate records, a signature technique repeated, small changes. A letter swapped near a surname's end. A middle initial added where none had been used before. ages rounded to neat halves of decades. On the teacher's roll, a student's first day landed just after the census. On the church list, a mother's name accompanied 2 christenings fewer than 6 months apart. None of these alone proved anything. Together, they drew a faint circle around a household holding tight. A county engineer mentioned, over a file request and a map laid flat, that the creek was slated for a new culvert upgrade. Work like that turned soil and exposed what had been hidden. If graves sat close to water, and in the hills they often did, bones might move. If an old bottle dump slid, documents might surface. The calendar now gained weight. Weather could become witness. By the end of the first pass through paper and place, the same letters returned like a creek curve. The boy listed as son, then implied as father. The infant who was both sibling and child. The young woman who carried a name that doubled for sister and wife. The Hearth Circuit seemed less rumor and more structure. If so, who maintained the circle, out of fear, out of profit, out of habit? And what ledger kept them turning? Act 2 will pry at the ledger itself. The paper trail widened into a valley of kin. A sketch that began with May and her boy, Eli, now reached backward to a man recorded as Harlan Pike on a mining script book from the decade before the war. The script listed him as injured and then absent, a sequence that often meant a household turned inward for labor and comfort. Church rolls from a ridge mission the following winter placed May as a widow with dependents. In the gaps between those lines, the household reorganized around the fire. Who slept where? Who carried water? Who bore children? The pattern took the name already whispered by later sociologists, here, the Hearth Circuit, and it bent time and bodies toward an inward loop. The genealogy stretched across 4 generations if counting the patriarchs and the infants who did not live long. At the turn of the century, a daughter of May's mother, here called Nora, appeared in a marriage docket with a man who shared a grandparent's surname spelled 3 ways. The docket listed witnesses who were also kin, a common necessity in a county where neighbors were kin by default. Over the next decade, births arrived at intervals that ignored standard spacing. A child in late winter, another in late autumn of the same year, a lull through 2 harvests, another cluster. The father's given name repeated, then fell away, then returned, as if borrowed and returned like a mule harness. The household's interior rules overrode the courthouse's exterior ones. A feed and tack storebook surfaced in a barn auction on the river flats. Its columns recorded credit slips and deliveries, lamp oil, salt pork, coarse flour. On several dates, a small sigil appeared where a customer's initial would usually go, a circle nested inside a triangle, sometimes inverted, sometimes not. The circles matched calendar spans when the household's adolescent males were listed as absent from school, only to return with poor attendance and bruised knuckles noted by a teacher's tight hand. Those marks were not confessions, they were hints. They pointed to timing, and timing, counted forward by human gestation, pointed to beds. The first major discovery arrived not in a courtroom but at an estate sale 2 ridges over, when an old flour tin yielded a notebook wrapped in oilcloth. The librarian found it with the permission of the seller, a descendant by marriage who wanted cash more than memories. The notebook's pages had been ruled by hand. Each line carried what looked like a household ledger: who chopped wood, who hoed rows, who fetched from the spring. Threaded among the chores were the same sigils from the feed book, now aligned to nights near new and full moons. A handful of entries added a small hash mark like a fence post beside the sigil. When cross-checked against the misfiled birth register, births clustered roughly 9 months after fence post nights. The pattern did not name acts, but it measured them. Within those marks, a system hid in plain view. When Harlan's name ceased on script, a fence post appeared beside Eli's sigil for the first time. The ledger did not say he slept with his own mother, but the calendar said it for him. The genealogy zoom-out put faces against that calendar. Eli aged from a boy on a school roll to a farm laborer on a county list to a father on a birth line. Lisa, listed as a child under May's roof, later appeared in the same house as housekeeper, a label often used by clerks to make an impossible arrangement less conspicuous. The school report marked Lisa as withdrawing just before midsummer 1 year. A birth under May's roof followed in winter. When the infant was christened, the mother was listed as May. Months later, another infant, likely Liza's, arrived without a father named. Later, still, a father's given name matched Eli's, then was scratched, then overwritten with a cousin's who lived 3 hollows away. The page showed 2 inks, old and newer. The ledger's fence post and the register's overwriting conspired to hold the same silence. Institutions did not know what to do with a silence that left stains. The local sheriff waved the notebook away as a chore list marked by a bored hand. The county attorney noted that the people involved were dead, and the law dealt poorly with ghosts. A call to the state attorney general's archives brought 2 quiet visitors with metal cases, who examined the notebook in a back room and asked to borrow it for imaging. They returned it with a promise to report, then sent a letter months later that paraphrased as appreciation without action. Jurisdiction traveled back and forth like a borrowed horse. The second major discovery did not wait on letters. In late spring of 1921, a storm crawled up the river and stalled for a day. The creek in Clay Hollow ran brown and fast, and the bench of ground where the cabin had stood lost a bite along its edge. On the morning after the rain, a child picking up kindling found a small carved board with a pattern of tacks and thread, the kind midwives sometimes used as a charm to fix a baby's luck. A little farther down, a scatter of bead buttons shone against the silt. When the ground sagged again by late afternoon, a shape in the bank opened like a mouth. A set of ribs too small for a grown person, roofed by a plank. Then another, a span length away. It was not a mass grave, it was a row, careful, short. Word reached the county reached for the coroner reached for the state. Counting in such soil is an art that declines to be precise. The officials recorded that the site held several child burials, likely infants, traced along a run of years marked by the types of nails used in the planks and the weave of the cloth that still hung as shadow. The row curved slightly with the bank, and a few of the planks had been repurposed from a crate, their stenciled letters still faint in places. The distances between the tiny graves suggested more than one loss in some years and fewer in others. A span of winters, perhaps a dozen, had seen little bodies placed with quiet, their names unrecorded beyond a mother's memory. The Hearth Circuit, defended as survival by those inside it, exacted its price in the dirt. The librarian mapped the burials to the ledger. Fence post nights often led to a christening line. Sometimes they did not. The small graves sat within 2 paces of one another, never farther than the reach of a person laying a plank by lantern light. The flow of the creek matched the flow of the ledger's months. What paper hinted, earth confirmed. The storm turned speculation into evidence that needed care. The county called the state. The state asked whether federal jurisdiction applied because the creek fed a river used for interstate commerce. That question suspended everything for a season. During that time, the librarian traveled to a nearby town where a hospital archived its early nursery logs. The nursery had handled transfers when home births failed. 2 entries from winters a few years apart listed May by a misspelled surname, accompanied by an infant described in a way that hospital clerks of the time used for babies whose features prompted whispers. Both entries ended with the same word, removed. Whether the infants went home or to the ground, the logs did not say. The ledger's fence post nights fell 9 months before both. The encoded marriage math inside the notebook grew more legible as the librarian learned its marks. A triangle left unfilled beside a woman's initial meant she would not be paired that season, often after a recent delivery. A circle filled dark meant a pairing retained despite gossip. A triangle crossed by a faint line often presaged a name change on a later record, as if a proxy father would be supplied to future documents. In one sequence, an adolescent's initial gained a fence post, then the circle filled dark beside it for several months in a row, then a gap appeared, then another fence post beside a sister's initial. The system did not hide its intent, it hid its language. Translation was the crime's mirror. A timeline took shape that felt less like a story and more like a nerve exposed. From the death of Harlan, read from Scrip's absence, to the first fence post beside Eli's hands, to Liza's withdrawal from school, to the overwriting of a father's name, to the storm and the bank that let go, to the coroner's note, to the state's visitors with cases. Each step loosened the Hearth Circuit's hinge. The librarian drew a line from the old cabin to the nearest rail spur to the county seat, a path that would take a young person a day if leaving on foot with a sack over the shoulder. That line mattered because someone had to have walked it. A boarding list from the Children's Aid on a summer day listed a girl by Liza's middle name, placed as a domestic in a Rivertown household. The entry did not mention Clay Hollow. It did not need to. Institutional friction waited at the courthouse door. A grand jury was convened in form, then recessed in practice, with the rationale that evidence had been disturbed by weather and time. The sheriff urged patience, the state urged further review, the coroner urged dignity. Reports used passive voice to keep hands clean. A newspaper in a nearby county carried a paragraph about the creek exposing several small interments, and then moved on to Affair's prize-winner pumpkin. The librarian added clippings to a folder that felt heavier than paper. The turning event that forced action came not from pity, but from a culvert plan. The county's new drainage project required excavation near the row. Legal counsel from the state recommended removal and study to avoid liability. That language, sterile as it sounded, was the lever. The small bodies could not remain where a road would cut them. The county approved a limited exhumation, to be supervised by a university team that often handled such work when road projects crossed old cemeteries. With the soil opened and the plank fragments numbered, with cloth samples bagged, with bead buttons collected, the Hearth Circuit's quiet algebra would meet a lab's measured light. By the end of this act, the encoded ledger sat scanned and catalogued. The creek bank lay braced and pocked by flagged squares, and an evidence chain, flawed, late, still real, held across town lines. The librarian's role shifted from finder to witness. The system that had kept a son in a mother's bed, and later in a sister's bed, could no longer claim the comfort of invisibility. What remained was consequence. What could be charged, what could be acknowledged, what could be repaired without the living collapsing under the weight of the dead. The next step would decide whether the county named what it had been, or whether it let the road bury the rest under gravel and forgetting. The culvert contract turned a moral haze into a sequence of tasks. Surveyors hammered stakes along the creek's bend. The university team unrolled canvas tarps and strung twine into a grid. When shovels moved, the earth gave back in careful layers. Plank fragments with crate stenciling, bead buttons the color of pond water, cloth that was now only the memory of cloth. Each small skeleton was brushed from silt and logged. Long bones said weeks, unfused plates said months. The skulls, where intact, showed anomalies a clerk would have called peculiar and a pathologist would have called congenital. No spectacle could be found there, only evidence that the hearth had turned inward on itself until biology thinned. The notebook with its sigils sat open on a nearby table, its fence posts aligned to a row that could now be counted by touch. The county's attorney drafted a petition to move the remains to higher ground. The state, wary of precedent, insisted on a chain of custody and an inventory that would survive scrutiny. The university's report avoided the word incest while describing markers consistent with close kin unions. The coroner, more practical, wrote that the children had lived too briefly to name the cause beyond frailty and fever. The sheriff signed transport papers. A plain wagon carried the boxed remains to a corner of the pauper's field, where unmarked stones held the dead from fires, influenza, and lives that rarely left paper. A single field stone, nondescript and rounded, took a place for the creek's row. The grand jury returned an answer that was both true and useless. No indictments because the principals named in the records were gone. Eli, if he had been the boy who slept with his own mother and later with his own sister, had disappeared into the labor pool that fed the mines and the railheads. A slate fall in another county killed a young man with a matching first name in a year that fit. The mine ledger listed a burial paid for by co-workers. The grave lay in a crowded corner under a stand of cedar. May had died before midwives kept formal logs. The minister wrote the word consumption and drew a cross. Liza's name migrated through 2 spellings and then out of the hollow entirely, attached to a boarding placement that led to a Rivertown household. No criminal case could be made against a routine. The state and county negotiated a consent decree instead. It spelled out 3 changes that read dry and felt radical in practice. First, midwives who delivered outside the hospital would bring their small books to the registrar each quarter, where a clerk would cross-check initials, ages, and addresses against school rolls and baptism lists. Second, school registrars would flag withdrawals linked to unexplained pregnancies and send a traveling nurse up the ridge with food, cloth, and questions. Third, the registrar's office would field test a new form that placed the mother's name and the source of the father's name on separate lines, forcing any proxy to declare itself as proxy. The decree did not say Hearth Circuit, it said household safeguarding. It avoided shame in its language and used paper as a lever. Implementation was messier than ink. Some midwives refused to carry their books to town. The county borrowed a traveling car from the state to bring a registrar to church porches and store counters. Some families bristled at nurse visits. The nurses brought coal and lye soap along with measuring tapes. Teachers hesitated to report. The decree paired reporting with small grants for coal and repair, so that to tell was to help. Churches negotiated a role, agreeing to highlight civil marriage as protection rather than a test of virtue. It was not a crusade. It was an administrative braid woven through familiarity and fuel. The ledger with sigils moved from a flour tin to a climate box. The state archivists photographed each page under raking light. The symbols grew sharp in the digital prints. Circles nested in triangles. Fence posts aligned like tally marks. Initials that could be matched to a household, but never to a courtroom beyond doubt. The archivists returned a copy to the county library along with a note suggesting a future exhibit about paper and place. The librarian filed the copy behind a drawer that stuck on damp days, then drafted neutral captions. The first exhibit visitors were more curious than scandalized. The second wave arrived after a local radio segment spoke, carefully, of a past that had mortgaged its children to hunger. Rehabilitation did not take a single shape. Liza, placed as a domestic when barely more than a child, adapted with a discipline that was its own language. A city directory a few years later showed her as laundress in a household that kept hens in a small back lot. Another city directory, later still, listed her under a husband's name and a small rented house near the river levee. A baptism ledger in town recorded 2 children with ordinary ears and strong lungs. Once, after she had become a woman with a full apron pocket, she rode back up the rail line and walked the last mile along the ridge. She stood by the fieldstone in the pauper's corner and left bead buttons in a small pile. Then she left again. She did not take the ledger. She did not need to. Her adapting looked like not returning. Ruth, the infant who survived the winter after the storm year, never fully escaped the circuitry that made her. As a young adult, she drifted between farm kitchens and mill boarding houses. A clinic record in a river town described nervous spells that left her still and then startled. She worked when she could, sat with infants when mothers needed a night, and returned sometimes to Clay Hollow to help a woman who remembered her as a baby. When she was older, a state hospital note described her as simple and kind. She died with a few coins and a comb in her effects. Her struggle does not fit a tidy arc. It settles instead into the slow, ordinary courage of continuing. A third story belongs to a boy placed by the Children's Aid in a household that kept books and hens in equal measure. He took to numbers, learned where ledgers cracked, and grew into a clerk who understood that paper could be either a cover or a key. In middle age, he returned as a volunteer with the rural outreach program born from the consent decree. He taught registrars how to read past misspellings and how to notice a child listed as son in one line and as father in the next. He avoided the hollow where he had been born. He advocated by refusing to allow routine to outrun attention. The decree acquired a name when the legislature revised vital statistics procedures, the Hollow Creek provision. It mandated cross-checks between birth registers, midwife books, school rolls, and church christening lists in counties where distances made rules brittle. It also funded a small office in the state archives to train clerks in detecting soft frauds, overwriting, proxy fathers repeated like proverbs, age roundings that hide pregnancies. Within a decade, the state's audit reported a measurable shift. Cases where a child's legal father could not be tied to any physical presence in the household fell by more than half in the counties that implemented the provision fully. The statistics did not mention the Hearth Circuit by name. They did not need to. The gap between rumor and routine narrowed into light. The place itself also changed, but it kept what it wanted. The road crews finished the culvert. Spring floods ran through it with a new sound. The county, during a better budget year, partnered with a land trust to acquire the bench where the cabin had stood. They called it Pike Bench Preserve for the mineral surveyor's surname, not for any family who once built a bed frame there. A sign at the trailhead did not tell the whole story. It spoke of early settlement, of timber, of the difficulties of distance. At the far edge, near the poplar stand, a small plaque no bigger than a hand carried a single sentence about the children whose graves had been moved uphill. The plaque did not instruct grief, it placed it. Records altered the future quietly. The registrar's office learned to treat hesitation as data. When a clerk noticed a father's name written with a different hand than the rest, she asked for another form to be filled at the church where the christening would be recorded. Nurses learned to knock twice and to leave food even when their questions were not welcomed. Teachers learned to write precisely in the margins, bruises on knuckles, absences clustered after planting, eyes shaped like an older brother's. The sheriff learned that to drive up a hollow with a badge was to sink his tires and his chances in equal measure. Nurses with coal and registrars with forms traveled lighter. The Hollow Creek provision stayed in the code through administrations that preferred other headlines. Years later, the librarian walked the preserve trail with a copy of the scanned ledger in a satchel. The creek sounded ordinary. A child dragged a stick along the fence. Poplar leaves flashed pale and then bright. The chimney stones still stood, black lichen deepening where rain did not reach. The librarian stood where the bed frame had rusted into the hill and watched a hawk ride a thermal that smelled faintly of damp fern. The story, now that it had been named and archived, existed in 2 registers. Paper said that a boy listed as son became a father within the same roof, that an infant entered the world as sibling and child, that a sister carried a second title she never sought, that a system with sigils ran like a loom until weather broke it. The landscape said nothing. It kept the coolness that rises where water runs under rock. It kept a child's shoe heel softened by rot and time. It kept quiet where the ledger had been loud. Resolution here did not mean the past obeyed the present. It meant that the county chose a paper habit that placed a thin, durable wedge between hunger and the beds it bends. It meant that the dead were carried uphill and given a corner of ground where their row would not collapse into the creek. It meant that a woman who had been a child in a ledger found a way to live under a name that stayed the same across directories. It meant that a law, named for a place rather than a person, taught clerks and nurses how to see a pattern and to put a form in its path. On the trail back to the road, the librarian passed the plaque and thought of the circle inside the triangle, of the posts drawn as fences, of months counted by moon and by chore, of a seat by a fire that held more than warmth. The ledger rests in a box now. The creek runs under stone. The story breathes between them, quieter, sturdier, and unwilling to be misfiled again.